going to be looking at NGO reactions to the report of the UN Secretary General, which I think probably all of you have had a chance to see, came out last week, in the context of the upcoming World Humanitarian Summit. And in today's discussion, which is sponsored by the Norwegian Refugee Council and organized in collaboration with NRC, we have a panel of 5 NGO representatives, and we'll be starting by looking at the substance of the Agenda for Humanity. Now, the Secretary General's report, which is entitled One Humanity Shared Responsibility, presents, as you've seen, an Agenda for Humanity divided into 5 core responsibilities and 122 recommendations. We've been working with our panel to identify a few specific issues that they're going to be picking up in their comments today, so we can really dig into the substance of what's being proposed and what's on the table here. And then in the Q&A, and as the discussion progresses, if there are questions or a desire to discuss some of the process related to the summit, that may come up as well. So I'll move now to introducing our panel. Very pleased to have with us today, first of all, Virginie Lefebvre, who's joining us from the Amon Association International, joining, I believe, from Lebanon today. And we also are pleased to welcome Anne Herry, who is joining us from Handicap International Federation. Also very pleased to welcome Brooke Loughton, joining us from the Norwegian Refugee Council, as well as Ahmad Faisal Pardaus, joining us from Mercy Malaysia, who's serving both as president of Mercy Malaysia and chair of the board of ICFA, International Council of Voluntary Agencies. And then last but not least, very pleased to welcome back Gareth Price-Jones, who is joining us in his capacity today as Senior Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Coordinator with CARE International. So a warm welcome to all of you. Apologies for the very brief introductions, but I think we're all eager to get into the substance of today's discussion and keep a dynamic, fast pace so we can get through a lot of the substance that we have in front of us today. So I think we'll move right ahead if we have her on the line.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So first of all, many thanks to our PHAP and NRC colleagues who initiated this online event. I would just start very briefly by presenting Amon Association International, the organization I'm working with, and then address local NGOs' perspective on the SG report, and particularly how localization is tackled in the Agenda for Humanity. So very briefly, what is Amon? Lebanese non-sectarian NGO created in 1979. We're working through 24 centers, 6 mobile medical units in the most vulnerable areas of Lebanon, and in different sectors, including health, education, child protection, vocational training, livelihoods, human rights promotion, human rights protection, and other programs. So we are working with different populations without discrimination, including Lebanese, but as well as Syrian, Iraqi, Sudanese, Palestinian refugees, and migrant domestic workers. It is within this framework that Amel has been active in the WHS process, and I think that this is an illustration of the importance of the local NGOs' involvement in this process. So from the organization of the Lebanon National Consultations to the follow-up of, some follow-up roundtables, led by Amel in partnership with Lebanon Support, to the participation to regional consultation and international conferences, we promoted together with various NGOs and humanitarian actors the importance of localization as an ongoing process directly contributing to enhance aid effectiveness. So we are expecting, we were expecting, we are still expecting many calls for changes, notably through the SG report and the Agenda for Humanity. So talking about the SG report and the agenda, I must say that we are generally satisfied with its content, notably because localization is addressed in various core responsibilities, including recommendations on capacity building, partnerships, support to host communities, resilience, complementarity, and predictable financing for local NGOs, notably through country-based pool funds. However, what remains a little bit unclear for us is how this localization will be effective. How will it be enhanced? And well, this is generally raising the question of how are we effectively enabling localization. So I have two general comments on this with various illustrations. The first one is in the agenda for humanity, I feel that there is a lack of recognition of what is already existing. In other words, localization, and I mentioned it before, is an ongoing process. And this should be acknowledged through evidences. Particularly, I have two examples where really I feel that best practices would strengthen the recommendations and would push and donors to commit to these recommendations. So the first one is in relation with the core responsibility one, build capacity in national governments and regional and international organizations to analyze risks and monitor deteriorating situations. So these capacities are already existing in many countries. So why are we saying build? I feel we should be more into strengthening and capitalizing on these particular capacities and name some examples of capacities we have in the countries in relation with contingency planning and other preparedness processes. The second example is related to established platforms between national and local governments and civil societies to enable men and women of all ages, different religions and ethnicities to engage and work together on civic issues and promote constituencies of peace and nonviolence. So we already have a lot of platforms, and I feel like if we're saying this establishing, we are likely to fall into the duplication trap. What we need to do is to provide tools to ensure that really these platforms will enable at the local level an efficient response. So again, here it would have been interesting to have evidences, and it is interesting still to promote those evidences. Second point I would like to raise on how we are really going to effectively enabling localization with this report, with this agenda, is the lack of targets in relation with localization. In other words, how are we really going to make sure that this localization will be achieved? How are we going to measure this? Well, I believe that we need to set up targets, even though many individuals, organizations are afraid about targets. This is for me one of the most important ways we can use to monitor the implementation of the recommendations included in this agenda for change. So we have many examples in the agenda for humanity where recommendations need targets. I have listed in the PowerPoint presentation 4 key examples for me. The first one in relation with the core responsibility tree and this idea of having direct appropriate national resources and international financing. So here we need a time target by 2020, by 2019, whatever it is, but we need to have a realistic target with a percentage of funding which will go in these national resources, in these national and local systems. Second example, again from the core responsibility tree, provide adequate long-term and predictable international political and financial support. So again, here we need to be a little bit more precise. What is going to be the support in terms of quantitative information, but as well we really need a deadline. We need to say by this year we will have achieved this. And then the support and enable national and local leadership and their preparedness and response capacities. Same thing, we need to commit human and financial resources. What I want to focus on this point on lack of targets in relation to localization is this particular recommendation for the core responsibility 5, invest in humanity, which acknowledges in fact that we need to develop concrete targets to increase direct and predictable financial to national and local actors. So here we acknowledge the fact that we need a target, but this is not enough. We need really to have in this agenda for humanity the targets already into it. We cannot keep on saying that we need to set up targets. So we need to make of this agenda for humanity a reality, and for this purpose we need to discuss ways forward in order not to miss the WHS momentum. So what is the way forward? Well, we need, from my point of view, to strengthen this framework, the Agenda for Humanity, which is already released, and more concretely to promote a clear compact, particularly for states and donors, including commitments and pledges to action. This very practical package needs to recognize existing practices at the local level, but not only, but for me at the local level first, present measurable indicators, propose capacity building opportunities. For me, these are the priorities, but there are others for sure as well. And these need to be proposed by who? Well, by local NGOs, indeed, but as well by international NGOs, UN, affected communities, and any other relevant stakeholders. Need really to work on this very concrete, compact, which needs to go with the agenda for humanity. It is very important as well because right now we still have some donors and some member states who are working on their contribution, their commitment, their pledges for the WHS. So if they have in their hands some documents ready with some suggestions of targets, of clear indicators, for sure it can inspire what they are going to present at the Istanbul Summit. Where this is going to take place, well, I told you, with donors, with UN agencies, but as well at the local level, at the national level, with our governments, and at the regional level, in universities as well. How practically, which methodology are we going to use to develop this and to promote this? Well, for me, one very important thing in terms of promoting this compact is the importance of sharing information in relation with all the preparatory work which is currently ongoing before the summit. There are various roundtables taking place. We also have calls for papers, many staff events which are currently being organized within the framework of the World Humanitarian Summit. I'm doing a little bit of publicity for a side event which is being organized by Amon and Lebanon Support and entitled Localizing Responses to Crisis, Lebanon as an Incubator for Innovative Practices. So we have all these events. We need to share information. We all need to be aware as NGOs, as UN agencies of what's taking place in order to have synergies between our compact if we're not able to come up with one single compact. Indeed, there will be lobbying with countries, conferences, and the WHS in itself. And finally, I would like to say that I think that this particular point will be addressed later on, but really I want to stress on this is that the WHS is not the aim, right? It's only a tool, a momentum that we have, but really it is crucial right now, and we've already started to think about how we will follow up, particularly as local NGOs. So I hope that we will be able as well to address later on this point. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Virginie. And we'd like to move now, if we have her on the line, to Brooke. Brooke Farsi, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I am going to talk a little bit about the report's attention to protection and displacement. And like my colleague before me, NRC was generally quite pleased with the SG's report, and particularly with its attention to protection issues. While we felt that it did not fully capitalize on the protection language that we would have liked to see, it did in fact provide substantial substance to what addressing protection concerns should look like. Specifically, the focus on humanity and the emphasis on, quote, safety, dignity, and worth of individuals that must be protected and respected is practically at the core of what protection is. The report starts, and really throughout the document, there's a heavy emphasis on greater respect and commitment needed for international humanitarian law and human rights law. I think what's important to recognize is these bodies of law, particularly IHL, are not designed to be optional. And while there's some variation on the level of obligation imposed on states by human rights instruments, the increasing violations of the most fundamental and generally agreed upon covenants is equally unacceptable. We saw at the 32nd conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies that getting a stronger commitment from states on IHL is quite difficult. But the fact that the SG has featured this so prominently in his report shows the importance of such a commitment being made. NRC, oh, sorry, I have not moved the slides forward. NRC agrees that signing up to these treaties and conventions is essential, but ultimately it's not the most important step in ensuring protection of people affected by conflict and disaster. It's a first step, and it's an essential step, but it's only a first step. What follows in terms of integration of these covenants into national legislation and the ongoing exchange between civil society and decision makers is substantially more important. But even if this is done, even if it's integrated, there's still the question of consequences for violating the commitments. And I think the SG's report makes strong recommendations on where we can be better at combating impunity. The SG calls for stronger leadership in guiding public discourse, sparking national debate, and building support for policies that uphold humanity. But what concrete measures can be taken to make sure that this happens? If doing the right thing is not enough to motivate states, what shifts in thinking, language, and action are required to achieve the same intended outcome? How do we move from signing instruments to ensuring they are actually acted upon? In terms of consequences to violations of IHL, some of the interesting proposals from the SG include considering new ways of tracking and reporting violations, which, while NRC agrees that there's room to explore, we would need to be careful to balance the need for naming and shaming, which is often a component of monitoring and reporting, with the need to maintain neutrality. The greater use of independent commissions of inquiry was another recommendation, alongside obligating states to analyze possible negative unintended humanitarian consequences before acting, potentially setting prevention thresholds against which states cannot move forwards. He gave specifically the example of the arms treaty and using other similar mechanisms. Lastly, one quite interesting proposal is suggesting that the Permanent Five commit to withholding the veto power, their veto in the case of mass atrocity. This is in line with other proposals that have been put forward, the French-Mexican proposal, as well as the proposal from the elders, and those could be steps in the right direction. It is, of course, important for us to use the WHS to increase commitments of states to treaties and conventions that are the foundation of IHL and human rights law, but it will be interesting to see if the call for greater respect for IHL can lead to change that extends beyond these signatures to real shifts that ensure greater respect for the commitments that those signatures represent. Moving on to the broader sense of protection, the report does give substance to what we should be focused on when seeking to provide protection to affected populations. The reality is that ambition requires much more than a commitment to IHL, and this is reflected in the report. While the phrase centrality of protection is only mentioned once in the document, the report does urge the prioritization of a range of issues for which protection is the central concern. Specifically, he gives attention to POC, to displacement and migration, statelessness, GBV, attacks on education and healthcare. While they're not always noted as such in the report, these are protection issues. We feel that by highlighting them, the SG has created the space for us to look more critically at what has been done to date and what could be done to address these important humanitarian concerns going forward. Notably, the report looks at key protection threats, core issues of vulnerability, as well as the capacity of affected populations to deal with both. It is in this way that we see the strength of a report on protection. If we're successful in addressing protection threats, in decreasing the individuals' and communities' vulnerability, while simultaneously increasing their capacity and resilience, we will fundamentally be better able to respond to protection needs and ultimately uphold the rights of those affected by conflict and disaster. The question of leadership on protection was also addressed. While he could have been more specific in this regard, there are repeated mentions of the Human Rights Up Front initiative, which is a good step in the right direction. NRC would like to see this initiative take on a bit more substance in the overarching humanitarian community, but we feel that the SG's repeated reference to it is basically an invitation to humanitarian leadership to do just that. Notably, there is quite a bit of focus on state leadership and encouragement for civil society to push for continued leadership on humanitarian issues. NRC would be interested to see how leaders step forward on this and the ways in which state actors take on leadership roles in ensuring protection. Sorry, I'm just trying. So there's two key areas that I wanted to specifically mention. The first, of course, is forced displacement. As a displacement organization, NRC was particularly interested in the SG's call for a fundamental shift in our approach to internal displacement and for setting the target of a 50% reduction in forced displacement by 2030. We would applaud the willingness to invest in seeking out durable solutions for the millions of displaced in the world, but we would like to emphasize that attention to dignity implies that an individual's agency must always be prioritized. This includes when dealing with and responding to displacement. Thus, NRC feels that we must shift the discussion from reducing displacement to respecting rights, including protection, freedom of movement, and non-refoulement. Reducing forced displacement means giving people the space to make choices about movement. We need to be careful that commitments to reducing displacement are not reduced to preventing people from moving or sending them back to unsafe areas. Rather, it requires greater sharing of responsibility and ensuring these key rights are collectively upheld. The second core topic that I wanted to speak briefly about was on access. We feel that the report does address humanitarian access quite well, as it's raised throughout, beginning with looking at the respect for IHL, through shifting to our approach to assessment and response, to ensuring the most vulnerable are at the center of our mission. Proximity and therefore access is key for protection. We feel that humanitarian space must be preserved to achieve this, and NRC is reassured by the call for respect for humanitarian principles in the report. We're pleased to see specific reference to retaining emergency capacity and response, as this suggests that the push for complementarity and increased integration will not be allowed to go so far as to compromise the neutral, impartial, and independent nature of humanitarian action. We feel that what the humanitarian endeavor needs is not more politicization or monopolies of decision-making, but a rationalization of the complementarities and flexibility of different tools and actors. Sorry. In terms of going forward from here, I think I would like to just speak specifically about the focus on collective outcomes as one of the big shifts in which protection needs to play a central role. Protection is less prominent in the SG's discussion of collective outcomes than perhaps we would have liked to see. And there's some concern that the centrality of protection could get lost in the process of focusing on collective outcomes. Showing protection outcomes suffers the same challenges as some of the challenges mentioned in his report around prevention. Namely, generally, if you're successful, there's something that won't happen. So this is something that will need to be further fleshed out in the lead up to the summit in terms of how protection outcomes are maintained as a central focus for the collective outcomes call. Interestingly, the protection community completed a whole of system review in this past year, and there was a recommendation from that review to look at protection from a whole of caseload approach, which is basically which with some caveats, is basically the protection version of collective outcomes. This recommendation at the time, and continues to be, one of the most controversial recommendations from that review, in part because it's difficult to align with a system that is defined by mandates. So we feel in NRC that the push for collective outcomes in the Secretary General's report provides an important opportunity to shift our way of analyzing humanitarian needs in a way that can yield significant protection dividends. Thus, I would just like to say that NRC would look forward to working with other protection actors and interested parties to ensure that collective humanitarian outcomes ultimately have a protection impact. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Brooke. For those of you who have perhaps joined us a few minutes into the event, I'll just briefly recap. We've heard from Virginie Lefebvre with AML Association International, who was speaking on a number of points, but particularly strong on the issue of localization and how that's appeared throughout the report. And now we've just heard from Brooke Loughton with Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, looking particularly at issues related to protection and displacement. We're now going to turn to Anne Relations with Handicap International Federation. Anne, I'm very pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be invited to speak to this webinar, and I must say that this is my first webinar ever, so I will do my best and to be clear. So first of all, maybe a few details on Handicap International. So the organization works in 65 countries in the field of humanitarian assistance and also in the field of mine action. We work also in disability and development field. Also, we are organized around a federal network with national associations in the UK, in the US, but also in many European countries. And advocacy is completely part of our social mission and mandate. So before starting into the details of the comments upon the report from the Secretary General, I would like to make a very global comment about the WHS process and about the ambition of the Agenda for Humanity. It's very ambitious because it addresses a whole range of issues, starting from conflict prevention, humanitarian principles, international humanitarian law, the link between emergency and development, the role of national actors, local actors. So it's very, very ambitious. But at the same time, it seems that the international community is more and more failing in protecting civilians and upholding the principles of humanitarian action. And I think it's very paradoxical to think that in a few months, almost the entire humanitarian community will be gathered in Istanbul at the very door of one of the most awful and terrible humanitarian crises. So I think this is really something which is a paradox, and I really hope that the international community will manage to take very concrete recommendations. So about a few elements in the report. I would like first to speak a little bit about the Leave No One Behind recommendations, core responsibility. So Leave No One Behind is really about how humanitarian assistance has to focus on the most vulnerable. So this is really something that we as Handicap International welcome very much. Because the reaffirmation that our commitments as humanitarian actors requires reaching everyone is very much in line with the humanitarian principle of impartiality. And it's very reassuring because in the consultation process, we had the feeling that maybe we were speaking too much of aid effectiveness, and we were thinking too much about the reduction of cost, when we think that really aid effectiveness should be measured against the ability of humanitarian assistance to reach everyone and to focus on the most hard to reach, the marginalized, vulnerable, crisis-affected populations. So this Leave No One Behind really gives us a lot of hope in this direction. But of course, although it is very clearly stated in the core responsibility, Leave No One Behind, the way this will be translated into the other core responsibilities, and in particular the core responsibility 5, Invest in Humanity, is not very clear. And it's true that the Grand Bargain in particular relies on the notion of efficiency, which seems to be very much focused on cost reduction. And this is why we would really like to see more precise commitments on how funding modalities will better take into account inclusion of the most vulnerable. Also, the recommendations listed in the Agenda for Humanity do not sufficiently address the challenges faced by some of the marginalized groups. In particular, including persons with disability in humanitarian response would require more precise, concrete and detailed commitments. So in the next slide, sorry. We would really like to make sure that the commitments taken at the World Humanitarian Summit will address three main axes. The first must be to make sure that the international humanitarian community endorses standards and guidelines to make sure that humanitarian assistance is inclusive, and that it will also address how all the mechanisms can enhance the participation of persons with disabilities, and also that it will make sure that these standards and guidelines really allow more inclusive practices on the field. So we will work with various actors in preparation of this summit to make sure that we have more detailed and concrete high-level commitments on these three orientations. Then I would like to maybe just to address or to describe a few contradictions that seems to emerge from this report. The report really addresses both global and local issues, and sometimes it's difficult to see how both can reconcile. For instance, the report calls for an empowered leadership from national governments of affected countries into aid coordination. So this is a very good recommendation, but how will this work in the case of fragile states or conflict situations where you may have only partial, biased or fragmented control by local authorities? And this is not clear how humanitarian principles will be upheld in these situations. Of course, I'm thinking of situations like Central African Republic or Somalia or many other conflict situations in the world. Also, the shift from funding to financing, which is very often mentioned in the report, is based on the notion of collective outcomes, which must be predictable over multiple years. And these collective outcomes are opposed to multiple individual projects and activities. And the actors seen as having the comparative advantage to deliver these collective outcomes will be financed directly. And it really seems difficult for me to reconcile this with the push towards local actors and first responders who may lack the capacity to integrate such large plans. And also a third contradiction concerns the fact that those collective outcomes should be based on a common understanding of the situation from a wide range of actors. And they should aim, according to the report, to have a positive impact on indicators for SDGs. And really this will not help overcome obstacles to the timely delivery of urgent and life-saving protection. And this might even come at times in contradiction with this core objective of humanitarian aid. So really, I think in the path leading to the summit, we as NGOs, we will really have to work with other actors, with the governments in particular, to address these contradictions, to build more concrete commitments, and of course to make sure that the adequate level of efforts remain focused on making sure that crisis-affected people have access to timely, principled humanitarian aid. And that's it for me for today.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, and in particular for leading us up to this set of contradictions, which I think is really important to note, and your analysis of that is really welcome. So thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to giving the floor to Ahmed. I hope that we have you there, and warm welcome back to you.
Hi, thanks, Angara. I've been tasked with the unenviable topic of the grand bargain, which is a very important element of the core responsibility number 5, which is themed Invest in Humanity, and it's found on the Secretary General's report from pages 39 to 47, I think. And while we will concentrate on the Secretary General's report, there will be elements of the and details of the grand bargain which will be found much more in much more detail in the report by the high-level panel on humanitarian financing. Right. Without further ado, the Secretary General's report speaks of investing in humanity, and it also talks about investing in stability. Both these cliches are found even in the early parts of the Secretary General's report, not just in the theme of core responsibility number 5, meaning that the Secretary General and those around him have recognized very much the importance of investing in humanity, and the crucial role that financing and funding plays in ensuring that humanitarian action is taken to a higher level and for better response in the future. Now, the Secretary General's report also speaks very much about investing in local capacity. And here we have our colleagues, both Virginie and Anne, I think, talking very specifically about the contradictions, about how investing in local capacity would actually contradict some of the points that are already there, which are found in other parts of the Secretary General's report. This is particularly so if you look at other points like financing collective outcomes, as Anne had eloquently pointed out. Now, there is a very important part of core responsibility number 5, talking about investing in risk. Investing in risk was given priority. It speaks a lot about investing in disaster. I'm coming all the way in from Malaysia. So I think investing in risk was given a priority, but it talks a lot about investing in natural disasters and climate change situations. I think what's lacking there a bit is also investment in risk, in reducing risk for conflicts, which was touched a bit in another sub-element of correspondence number 5, which was investment in fragile states. But it's not actually the same, because not all states are fragile when they get into conflicts, although some are. Financing collective outcomes brings about the politician that there may be more joint operations, perhaps more joint assessments, more joint financing proposals, which in general is good, but we have to be aware of whether that actually leads to more equitability or more of the same, especially if most of the funding ends up in the hands of the same big players only. So there will be a contradiction there again with investing in local capacity. Shifting from funding to financing, I think 2 or 3 of us, in fact all 3 of the speakers had touched on this. It's an interesting element. It's a mindset shift in a way. It's also a practical shift from just finding a proposal for funding to actually looking at financing as a comprehensive tool and looking at other modes of funding, not just your usual traditional sending a funding proposal to a traditional donor. New approaches to financing was also mentioned, making financing more flexible, including diversifying the resources and the sources of funding, which includes new and alternative donors. This then brings us to a very important part of the presentation, which then it talks about creating the Sentinels talks about creating a new the creation of new platforms for protected crisis. With this being right, especially the Secretary General himself has noted that funding and financing for protected crises like the ones we have in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Darfur, and now increasingly so in Syria, has to find a new model. It's very, very unnerving and also very difficult for donors to find themselves to have to keep funding the same situation year in, year out without much progress. We see also that this also has an operational impact with regards to L3 and how L3 is being used currently. L3, which was supposed to be a surge capacity call for the humanitarian community in the face of major emergencies, has now also been transformed a bit into a sort of a funding mechanism, just to ensure that financing and funding still comes through when the emergency or the disaster or the conflict becomes more complex. I spoke a bit about the increasing in the diverse resource base. the Secretary General's report talks about private-public partnership, the increasing role of the private sector, and how we need to get the private sector more involved. I think everyone's in agreement with that general view. We have, however, of course, the discussion on how to integrate private sector interests and priorities into humanitarian ones. And sometimes there will be divergence. We cannot run away from the fact that some private sector actors will still look at the bottom line and how and will influence how they invest. Building national local capacity is mentioned very specifically in the Secretary General's report, but it's not again looked at from in a comprehensive way. There is this sub-element of increasing interagency humanitarian appeals and funding, and this also touches upon more cooperation and more collaboration between agencies. There's a very specific point on increasing the SURF funding from $500 million to $1 billion a year. Whether in the first place, whether that will be enough. In the second place, whether without any changes to how SURF is how SURF currently is being discussed, whether that will actually have any major impact. As we know, SURF is mainly for UN agencies, with perhaps a few select bigger NGOs also included. It will need a major transformation of the SURF mechanism to see this as a change.
Hi, Faisal.
Last but not least, of course.
Sorry, Faisal, if I could just quickly interrupt you. Apologies for that. I think we've got you on the other line again. If you could try the first line that we had you on. Sorry, the second phone line that you just picked up.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, the quality on the
okay.
the quality on the backup wasn't so good.
Right.
So hopefully this will be better.
Right.
Great,
Right.
thank you.
Sorry about that, people. As I was saying, increase in the SURF was specifically mentioned, but unless there's a major change in how SURF is being managed and how the disbursement is done, just increasing it from $500 million to $1 billion a year may not mean very much, especially if it goes still to only the operational UN agencies and perhaps a select few international NGOs. Last but not least is the point on increase in cost efficiency and transparency, which brings us to the very grand sounding topic of the grand bargain. Increasing cost efficiency and transparency, the grand bargain. Well, there is of course an increased need for visibility and transparency. We all acknowledge that. And I think we all agree that there's no substitute for better transparency and accountability in humanitarian action, and very much so financially. There's also a need for better reporting. Again, I don't think anyone will argue with that. The problem with this is, of course, where better reporting is concerned, we need, number one, harmonization of reporting, and we also need to see how reporting doesn't necessarily mean increased costs, especially for NGOs. And there is a big mention in the grand bargain in this element of increasing cost efficiency and transparency on the need to reduce overheads and costs, while at the same time we must aim to achieve a better outcome in the delivery of aid. So the call appears to be across the board. But a point that I would like to make is that this call for a reduction in overhead costs, while at the same time achieving better outcome in delivery of aid, must be done from the biggest players and cascade fairly down throughout the system to the smallest. It shouldn't be the other way around, though. There is a slight danger that if the grand bargain is implemented without looking at NGO priorities, that what will happen is that the sharpest end of the sword will probably fall on NGOs, especially on the smaller ones. And already we have problems, although everyone will say that they have a problem with this. We know very well that that smaller NGOs especially have very little to spare in terms of organizational development and overhead costs. So we are proposing that the grand bargain in any way, in any form, must achieve better aid delivery outcomes. If the intention of the grand bargain is just to reduce costs, that will not be sufficient, nor will it be acceptable. It must include harmonization of reporting costs and standards. ICVA is at the moment conducting a study on the harmonization of reporting and costs for NGOs, and we're working with a few UN agencies as well as a few NGOs to look at this meticulously. The grand bargain must not take away funds from those responding at the front line. I think Anne, or was it Brooke, and Virginia also had made this point. Those responding at the front lines must not be made to pay the most out of this grand bargain. We see Syria now as a very classic example. With 1,000 trapped at the border, we see that only the smaller local NGOs across the border in Syria are able to function directly. So, any grand bargain must take that into account. It must be equitable in the overhead cost reductions to ensure that NGOs especially can continue to function. And here I bring all of us to this point where some smaller NGOs really struggle year in, year out. There are NGOs, for example, in Africa, especially who are dependent on UNHCR funding. And we know how much overhead they allow. It's only between 7 to 8% a year. This is a big problem because it's already a big problem now. If the grand bargain comes into effect and that overhead cost is reduced further, it may not just hamper operations, it will actually also mean that some of these NGOs will find it very difficult to exist. It must mean better access to international funding mechanisms and financial tracking systems. When we talk about diversified resources of funding, these diversified resources of funding must also be tracked. Some of the issues that we have, for example, with private sector funding, as well as funding from other non-traditional sources, is that we don't know where it goes, and we don't know how much is spent, by whom, and where. And this adds to the confusion, and it deprives sometimes funding from reaching organizations as well as beneficiaries where they are needed most. There must be an emphasis on multi-year funding and financing mechanisms. The grand bargain mentions that, but it must be seen through. At the moment, the practice where NGOs especially have to bargain every year, at the end of every year, to get a little bit more next year must end. We must look at multi-year funding. There must be a push for donors to do this. And we must include NGOs in the discussions and framing of the concept of the grand bargain and its practical aspects from the outset, from now. With this, I think I just want to make a call to everyone in the audience as well as elsewhere that NGOs all around the world should make our voices heard, and especially on the area of the grand bargain, and ensure that our voice and our voices are not left out. Our priorities must be seen as well, especially taking into effect and taking into consideration that 70 to 80% perhaps of direct aid is delivered by NGOs in the field. I have just one more slide, which is related to that, but also in a general sense about NGO participation post-Istanbul. I think the answer to this is that it must begin now, before the WHS. It has already begun, of course, during the consultations. But now that we have the Secretary General's report and the report of the high-level panel on general financing, etc., we must have NGO participation from now. And I echo what Virginie said very much earlier. NGOs should make it a point to participate and include ourselves in forums and roundtables that are currently occurring. We must also push for participation at the main event during the WHS, and not just the side events, the exhibition fair and the innovation marketplace. I think NGO participation in the main event is essential for us to have a voice. And we must also participate, of course, in post-Istanbul forums and platforms determining the way forward, especially where the grand bargain is concerned. The concern is that if we don't participate, then other actors will definitely determine what the grand bargain will look like. And I think we really don't want that to happen. So thank you very much. Sorry for the technical problems.
No problem at all, and thank you so much, Faisal. Yes, apologies also for the hiccup there, but I'm for the second half at least. And thanks very much for your observations, your analysis, comments. Very much appreciated. Before turning to our fifth and final panelist, I'd just like to take an opportunity, first of all, to thank everyone for their really active participation in the discussion going on in the chat. It's great to see a really rich conversation going on there. And then also to remind everyone in the room here, if you have any questions for our panel, please do take a moment to put those in the Ask a Question box. We'll be coming up soon to our Q&A portion and want to make sure that any questions or additional points that you'd like to ask our panel to reflect on are there in the list. So please do take a moment to use the Ask a Question box. So now, last but not least, I'd like to welcome again and introduce Gareth Price-Jones, Senior Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Coordinator with CARE International. Gareth, over to you.
Thanks, Angarad. Yeah, so in terms of the report, like many of the other presenters, we're generally pretty happy. And you see the points on the PowerPoint. I won't go through them individually, but I think yeah, we're really pleased to see a lot of the things that we've been asking for. And I think the Secretary General's report really reflects a shift in the discussion. For many of you who were involved in the discussion, say, a year or so ago, we saw then that the discussion was really around how we tweak the humanitarian system, whereas we've seen a major shift into addressing the strategic challenges that we face. And particularly, so Faisal talked there to the issue around the funding. And there's a real danger that we sit here and see a $25 billion humanitarian system as anywhere near enough. But then when you compare it to the 0.03% that it represents of the global GDP, we need to be very clear that this isn't an issue of a shortage of money, it's a shortage of political will. Also, that we were having much more conversations now, and the Secretary General was quite strong on this, around the scale of need. Now, it's clear when you're looking at the scale of need that we're seeing, 60 million displaced people, service delivery is not enough. You know, no matter how efficient or how cost-effective the humanitarian system becomes, that's just not enough to meet the scale of the need. So we need that strategic addressing of those issues and the political issues behind them. And that brings me to one that hasn't been so much talked about, but is mentioned in the report, which is around climate change. And particularly if we look at where we're going to be in 2030, 2040, 2050, we're going to be looking at the kind of scale of challenge that really can't be met except through serious political action. And you know, for CARE, we're very pleased about the gender elements. We're slightly worried that it focuses very much on big players like us. I mean, particularly the development and humanitarian link. That works really well for us in CARE as a humanitarian and development organisation. But we want to be very clear as we go into the summit that actually that's not about closing off space to the more donantist responsive organisations like MSF and others. So the key issue, as I think Sadashu was saying in the chat box, how do we make this a reality? It's clearly, despite the Secretary General's call, there's clearly not one humanity. Certain governments and armed non-state actors clearly aren't up for the responsibilities that the Secretary General calls for, and frankly that's not going to change just because the Secretary General or because those of us in the humanitarian community ask for that to change. There's different political analyses out there that suggest you know, and we've seen with the concerns of, for example, Russia and China around the fact that humanitarian aid might be used as an excuse for regime change, or abuses of IHL might be misrepresented to drive political changes. And then coming back to the humanitarian system, the report says very clearly that the humanitarian system is resistant to change, and we need to look at why that is. Yeah, we've seen strong consensus in both the Secretary General's report and in the earlier synthesis report. And as again someone said in the chat box, we've been looking at a lot of this stuff for 35 years. So why hasn't it happened, and what's going to change with the summit process and what comes after the summit to change it. So in terms of, we've been looking and analysing about what's going to change state behaviour, and we think in CARE that there's two main reasons why states might change their behaviour. One is enlightened self-interest, and one of the things that's really changed over the last 6 to 9 months has been the realization of many states that you can't hide, you can't ignore the consequences of humanitarian action and humanitarian disasters. So that links through to the refugee crisis in particular, but also economic impacts and also impacts around the social impact for your own countries. So we've seen protests, we've seen also inspiring movements, particularly the welcome movement in Europe, the voluntary movements we've seen, those have been really, really key. Also, the kind of popular campaigns we've seen, the actions of some of the big NGOs and organisations like Avaz in mobilising popular protests and challenging some of the narratives that we see. For example, there's a huge narrative that says that rich nations simply can't cope with the scale of the disasters that we're seeing nowadays in the conflicts. But then we also saw the welcome movement of millions of people coming out on the street saying, actually, we can cope.
Okay, everyone, it seems we now may have lost Gareth. Sorry about that, not sure what's going on. So we'll try and give him a call, and hopefully we'll have him back with you in just a moment.
Hello.
Hi, Gareth. Yeah, we've got you.
Okay, apologies for that. So I'm not sure where you lost me, but basically, so just saying that also fear of the consequences is something that will potentially have an impact. So if we have serious state action, serious commitments from states, then we could well see that influencing what other states choose to do. So again, with the humanitarian system, there's general agreement, so why doesn't it change? And I think there's two elements here. One is around a belief in better. So for example, a lot of the things we talk around, will they actually change it, result in better impact? So we've talked for a long time about more coordination. Will that actually result in better impact for affected people on the ground? Or does that just mean that we'll see that's more transaction costs, more negotiations, slower aid? Also in terms of, for example, more accountability. One of the challenges we've seen is a real commitment to speaking much more to affected people before we respond has resulted in delayed response. So there's some real challenges there that we really need to acknowledge. The other big thing is bandwidth. So having been a country director myself, running large aid programs, a big challenge is not that we don't agree that, for example, we need to have gender data, we need to have really effective conversations with affected people, but it's making time for that. So we need to be really clear about how we create time, space and leadership to allow that. Now, more and more predictable resources would help with that. Career paths that support effective leadership are critical. And also, one of the things we've done a lot of work on is things like the CHS, key performance indicators, key impact indicators, that help us focus on what's really important. So, moving on, what does this mean for commitments? Now, many of us who've been involved in the World Humanitarian Summit, we've heard about these commitments that the process is asking us to make on the day, during the summit, and following up afterwards. What should they be? And key for that is that they need to be open commitments, not too detailed, but they need to address the underlying issues. So the details can be worked out later. They need to build on existing tools. So for example, there's been some concern expressed that the Secretary General's report throws away the clusters. That's not the way that we see it in care. We see that those tools are there, they're working better than anything has before, but there's certainly scope for improvement. But the commitments also need to be about the why. Why will stakeholders change? Why will states change their behaviour? Why will humanitarian agencies change? Why will donors change? And that's what we really want to see. And I just wanted to very quickly look at 3 examples of how this might work. So we've seen strongly, and Faisal mentioned it, the call for harmonised donor reporting. Now everyone agrees that that makes sense, but what stops it happening? So, and the main reason that happens is because there aren't those open conversations about the balance between reporting to your parliament or reporting back to your general public who give the money, and the need to have a simpler system. So unless we're discussing that, then we're not going to see the change we need. In terms of the IHL, for example, what's going to do that? And I talked earlier about the consequences. Okay, what do those consequences look like? Why would a state like Russia or Syria be concerned about those consequences? And that's what we need to talk about. And we need to talk about it with those states as well, say, okay, what would change? And finally, we've been talking a lot about kind of better accountability, better engagement with affected people. And again, what tends to happen there is we have proposals, for example, around assemblies of affected people to feedback on the assistance they're receiving. Now, many of us look at that and say, is that really practical when we've been working in big disasters or small disasters? Is that a practical response? And often the answer is not really. So when we're looking at those kind of commitments, when we're talking about saying, yes, we for example, we as CARE commit to talking to affected people and making sure their impressions and their ideas influence our programs, how do we make that practically work? It's not going to be through an assembly of affected people. So how do we make sure that those voices are heard in our decision making? So thank you. There's more details on our blog, but I know we're pushing on time and we're really interested as a panel to hear what you have to say. So thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Gareth. And yes, so we'll move into the discussion now. We do have a few minutes, although I think we'll have to keep things relatively brief. But we have a number of interesting questions here that I'd like to make sure to bring in. First, we have a question I think might be particularly valuable to direct this to Virginie. So Virginie, we have a question for you from Sudhanshu, who's based in India. It was discussed a bit in the chat. You may have seen just after your presentation, but I wanted to bring it in again. Sudhanshu points out that the premise that there is little or no capacity at the local level is maybe not a valid premise. The premise that there's little or no capacity at the local level and that it must be strengthened by outsiders is perhaps a flawed premise. And so he wants to ask, is there actually someone or something undermining local capacity that's actually the root of the problem? Sorry, apologies to Sudhanshu. I hope I've presented that appropriately, and over to you, Virginie, for your response.
Yes, so I totally agree with the comment. There are capacities in the local communities, in the local NGOs, and it is true that too often we're making the assumption that we need to build, that we need to create. I mentioned it most of the time. For me, it's more a matter of strengthening and of understanding what are the existing capacities. I think if we want to consider who or what is undermining the local capacities, we really need to have a contextualized analysis per country, because it will change from one country to another. Yeah, it's true that in certain cases it can be the international organizations, but in others it can be as well the authorities. So I would avoid making a generalization on this particular point. And this is why I'm convinced because local communities, local NGO are the first respondents, that we really have through this process to acknowledge their capacity, and that we have to provide evidences within the framework of this compact, of the different events we're holding, that we have these capacities. It's a shame we have to prove it, but at the same time, those are evidences which can be included in a compact, and then we can have basically member states committing to strengthen or to fund such initiatives. Just a very, very small point on a general question which was sent by Anne, I think. So I just think about a very little point about realistic outcomes. So I think that we need to be fair with the process. We will not reform the whole international humanitarian architecture. However, we can clearly expect member states to sign on clear and particular commitments, particularly in relation with localizations, if we have clear targets.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that. I'd like to turn now to Brooke, and we have a question that came in from Krista in the U.S., and I'm going to just read this out. It's a bit long, but I think important to read out. It's a bit of a detail question related to refugees and displacement. So Krista writes, the synthesis report described a proposed, quote, New Deal for refugees that was essentially a deal aimed at refugee hosting. The SG's report seems to go farther, calling for a, quote, new cooperation framework on predictable and equitable responsibility sharing for mass movements of refugees and, quote, an international framework, national legislation, and regional cooperation frameworks by 2025, focused on those displaced but without refugee status. What do you think this could or should look like? Is it realistic to expect a broader displacement deal with refugee hosting as one component of it, or should the summit focus more narrowly on solutions to the present refugee crisis? Over to you, Brooke.
That's the grand question, isn't it? Whether or not it's realistic or not, I think it's part of a larger process. So the questions around migration, refugee status, and displacement, the WHS is one of sort of a number of major events that are happening in which this conversation is being brought up, and the call for this responsibility sharing is, it's specifically mentioned in the report that the summit, the September 19th, what they're calling a summit on well, it has different names, but basically with a high level event looking specifically at the question of migration. So I think in that regard, the WHS is timed well to sort of build up to that. So yeah, I think the potential is there. I think it's definitely something that just in what we're seeing right now in Europe and in other places about resistance to, sharing that responsibility, we have to be somewhat realistic in expectations, but I do think there is an opening to broaden that discussion, to not just look at the durable solutions for refugees and IDPs, but actually look at how that is shared across states. So I think it will depend very much on the next few months leading up to the summit, and then subsequent actions leading up to the September event. But I don't think, well, I think there's reason to be concerned. I would like to still stay optimistic at this point that it is possible to come up with something where there would be a greater responsibility sharing mechanism in place.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Brooke. I'd like to now turn to Gareth on the same point. Gareth, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, definitely. So the point I wanted to make on that one was that absolutely the WHS shouldn't be focusing on the refugee crisis. This is even by global standards, it's not really a crisis. But what the WHS really must do is seize the political momentum that's come from that. And I think one of the challenges we faced a year ago with this discussion was that it really wasn't on senior politicians' radar around kind of humanitarian disaster. It was something they'd touch at when it came on the news and offer their sympathies, but they weren't seriously considering major decision making around it. I think what's shifted because of the European crisis, and there's many colleagues in Pakistan and Iran and Ethiopia and Kenya who say, what crisis? But it does mean that although this is very annoying for the states that host most refugees, it does mean that there's a new international political focus on humanitarian disasters. And that means that we might actually get some of the serious political action and political decisions that we need being taken in a way that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't had those people arriving on the beaches of Europe. So certainly not that we should focus overly on the European refugee crisis, but we should use the political energy that has generated.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Gareth. So we're actually we're running a bit short of time, and I think it's really important for us to make sure that we're able to go to each one of our 5 panelists for some closing remarks. I want to give each of you at least a minute and a half here at the end for any closing remarks, simply because we have had such a rich discussion in the chat, which will of course all be featured in the report. And because I think you may want to react to each other's presentations. So we'll go now just in the same order.
First.
Okay, actually we're going to go to Faisal first to try to avoid any connection problems, and then we will go to you, Virginie. So Faisal, if you'd like to come in for say a minute and a half, any closing comments you'd like to leave us with today.
Thanks, Angara. My 2 cents on the general comments would be that, number one, we have no choice but to be optimistic of the outcome of the WHS. However, we must work very hard at it. I think NGOs in particular, we need to seize this moment. We're not going to change the world. We're not going to, as Gareth said, will states change their behavior overnight? They won't, but we must make the points very clearly. And at the very least, we will get them to respect IHL a lot more than what they're doing now. At the very least, we must ensure that any change in the humanitarian financing system will lead to more equitable distribution, and that migration will not only be rhetoric and but actually will be played out and carried through practically on the ground. On the specific issue of the grand bargain, again, I'd like to encourage colleagues from NGOs especially, but also from other agencies to really give your inputs, especially to ICVA Interaction and others who are working very hard at the moment in lobbying the high-level panel, as well as those who will have an influence over the outcome of the grand bargain, to ensure that our points are made, and especially with regards to the distribution and the very loud rhetoric we hear on overhead costs and harmonization of reporting. They must be seen to be fair, and they must be made to be fair. Thank you very much, Angara.
Thanks a lot, Faisal, and thanks as always for making yourself available so late in the evening, your time. We really appreciate that. Now moving to Virginie. Virginie, do you have some final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with for today's discussion?
So I would like to share Faisal's optimism, given the fact that, well, we still have time, even though a little time, but we still have time to gain a commitment And well, for this purpose, I would like to reiterate my call for sharing information, and I said sharing input as well in relation with this preparatory process, because really this is the only way we can achieve something concrete and get things out of this process. I would like as well to take this opportunity to make a little point on the NGO representation. This was a question asked by one of the participants. So I think that we need to have a joint and global commitment to ensure that we will have affected communities in the room and that we will have local NGOs. And this is, I would say, a common responsibility we have, because we cannot represent them. They need to be there. They need to share their perspective, and they will be most probably the best individuals to express how we can really enable and implement the recommendations coming out of the summit.
Great. Thanks a lot, Virginie, and thank you for being with us today. We'll be moving now to Brooke. Brooke, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Just say that, I mean, looking at the Secretary General's report, basically a door has been opened for NGOs to really engage. I think what happens between now and the summit will really determine how successful the summit will be and how much we're able to come away from it feeling like we have seen the change that we want to see. I think what's interesting in the circles, at least in Geneva, is that there's kind of a hesitation, or not hesitation, but a curiosity from all sides of, okay, we've been given this sort of call to action. How are we going to do it? And I think there's a real opening there for NGOs to be quite prescriptive. And if we seize that properly, that we could really see some positive changes come from the summit. So I think that really we should all be working as much together as possible to make sure that happens.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, and thanks also for being with us. And now we're moving to Anne. Anne, do we have you on the line for some final thoughts?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I would like to stress one topic which has not been very much addressed during the consultation process, but which is clearly highlighted in the report of the Secretary General. And I think that it would be a really important outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit if we could have as many states as possible clearly condemning the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, because this is something very, very important to enhance the protection of crisis-affected communities. And there is currently an international process going on to try and stop the use of explosive weapons with wide array effect in populated areas. And really, the summit would be a key moment for as many states as possible expressing their condemnation about it and engaging towards a political commitment on the topic. And my second concluding remark would be that within the discussions to the summit so far, I think I could see a clear division between international and local actors, and I think that we as NGOs, we have to enhance the added value that we bring as non-governmental actors, because we provide the bulk of humanitarian action, we work closer to communities, and it is our diversity that allows us to address different contexts, and also our constituencies that allow us to convey the solidarity to crisis-affected communities. So I think that we must work as NGOs to emphasize our complementarity and our diversity and show how it is key to principal humanitarian action.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. Thanks for being with us today. And now, finally, we'll be turning to Gareth. Gareth, I understand we're switching connections with you again, so hopefully you're you're there.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Hi, Gareth.
Yeah, so
No, we can't quite hear you.
No. Okay, no.
You try.
Hi, have you got me now?
Oh, yes, that's good. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, second version is point on local voices. I mean, I think there's no amount of kind of INGO voices can compensate for the local voices. So it's really critical to get them there. The two key points for me would be around pushing for the commitment. So I said very clearly that states won't change their behaviour because the Secretary General asked them to. But if we can back up the Secretary General's report with our own voices to our own kind of popular mobilisation efforts, I think that will really help and will again raise the political and social cost of governments and others ignoring the need for change. And then the other thing is just to make sure that those commitments are there. So as one of my other fellow panelists mentioned, the need to be really propositional and say, this is what we want to hear these states, these political leaders say. And whether that's around harmonising reporting or having the conversations or stopping wars, those are the kind of commitments that we want to hear from the political leaders on the day in Istanbul.
Great, thanks a lot, Gareth. So thank you very much to all 5 of our panelists for being with us. Apologies that we ran out of time. It was a really fascinating discussion. Thanks so much to all of you for your preparations. We packed a lot into these 90 minutes, and I know I'm going to be looking forward to see the report and digest again all of the points that were made, which were really valuable. So thanks again for that. Also to all of your organizations. So AML Association International, NRC, Handicap International, Mercy Malaysia, and CARE. Thanks a lot to all of you. I'd like to thank my colleagues here at PHAP, Marcus Forsberg and Leonie Leborn, for making things possible technically on the back end, as well as Norwegian Refugee Council for initiating and sponsoring today's event. Thank you very much for your collaboration on that. We will have a recording available that will be at the link you see on the screen there. It should be available certainly by tomorrow, possibly sooner, but you'll certainly receive an email about that. And as I mentioned, there will be a report coming out within the next few days or a week that will be also mentioned in a follow-up email, and you'll be able to find it also on the event page for today's event on the PHAP website. So thanks again to all of you. We look forward to welcoming you for another live online discussion with PHAP in the near future. And until then, this is Ann-Herod Lang and colleagues signing off from Geneva. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you. Bye-bye.